Welcome to Blackbriar Gaming. Today we're going to have a look at my tried and tested strategy for choosing an old world faction. If you're like me, you may be torn in 2 or 12 different directions when it comes to starting a new army. Well, with my systematic decision table, we'll choose a faction together. This video will cover both core and legacy factions, as will all future videos of mine. While I understand GW's reasons for splitting the factions up, I see no reason why legacy factions shouldn't be collected, played, and loved equally throughout an old world adventure. Just a quick note before we get into it, a subscribe and a like really helps us reach a bigger audience. So if you enjoyed the video, please hit those buttons down below. So as with my Horus Heresy video on choosing a legion, for choosing a faction we'll be looking at the same 4 aspects. We'll be looking at aesthetics, playstyle, lore, and miniature range. Now, there are areas within these that are specific to old world factions, very different from choosing a legion. So let's dive on into aesthetics and have a little look at what that looks like. So within aesthetics, we have the paint scheme that you might want to go for. We have the style of the army, and then style of the faction, I should say, and then the theme of the type of army you want to collect. So starting up the top, the paint scheme. So within paint scheme, we have style. That's a little confusing. I've used that word twice, but we can either go out, then there's color, and then there's an ease of painting to that decision as well. So when making a decision about which faction you want to pick, how you want to paint it, and what you want to paint is such an important part of picking it. The last thing you want to do is pick a faction because of their rules, and then find out that you absolutely hate painting fur, for instance, if you've gone hard on Beastmen. So when it comes to the style of the miniatures, we're really looking at armor, skin, fur, bones, fabric, and scales with what you're looking to paint. And there are different ways to paint these various things. For instance, we're looking at scales. You might be looking at lizardmen. Yes, there's dry brushing, but contrast paints do an absolutely amazing and easy job with lizardmen. So that comes into it. So we'll start from the start. So armor. If you want to paint armor, you're looking at Empire, Bretonnia, Warriors of Chaos. You've got dwarves being a really key one here, where a lot of your work will be done just by dry brushing some silver. High elves, absolutely covered in armor. Dark elves get there as well. And probably chaos dwarves, the last one that really fall into the armor style when it comes to painting. So armor, super easy. You can get away with some serious shortcuts there, and it's going to bring an army together really quickly and onto the table very nicely. Painting skin gets a whole lot trickier. Now, there are contrast techniques now to paint skin. That's what I do with mine, and sometimes it looks really good. Sometimes it looks just okay, but that's my recommendation if you're going down that direction. Now, the various factions that I mentioned before show varying level of skin. A main one here is probably looking at Ogre Kingdoms, and the Orcs and Goblins, funnily enough, have large areas of skin on them. Now, that skin isn't necessarily colored like yours and mine. It will either be kind of a gray or, those yellow tones for the ogres, or it will be green. And if anyone listening to this video does have green skin, I severely apologize. That was very presumptuous of me. But if you don't want to paint a bunch of green skin, my goodness, do not pick orcs as your army, people. Fur. Fur's pretty easy. Dry brushing comes up great on fur. If you start with contrast, even better. Beastmen are probably the main one here that we're talking about, but Skaven definitely come into this as well, noting they have a bit more armor on them and a bit more fabric on them than the Beastmen do. Next up, bones. There's a couple. You've got the Tomb Kings, and to a lesser extent, you've got the Vampire Counts. Bones are super easy to paint, right? With the new contrast techniques around bones, bit of dry brushing over the top, you can get absolutely great results on your Tomb Kings very quickly, very easily. As we get to fabric, we get a little bit trickier. So now we're looking probably at more traditional painting techniques for large areas of fabric. Fabric that people are wearing just as clothes, actually contrast works quite nicely with, but those Bretonnia horses, Well, I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to give contrast a go on those horses because I have some coming, but whether it will work or not, or whether it will pull on those large flat surfaces and look a bit uneven, we'll have to wait and see. I'm sure there'll be some great videos out there when they drop, or really happening already, that show us how we can paint nice large areas of fabric quite easily. The scales I already mentioned, I think we're just talking about lizardmen for that one. Maybe there's some demons that get a little scaly. I don't think so, though. But yeah, lizardmen, scales, they love it. All about that contrast, all about that dry brushing. So have a think when you're choosing your faction, what do you actually want to paint? And when you've chosen a faction, have a think, do I want to paint this? Next up, colors. For me, this comes down to what I already have. So there's a bunch of armies upstairs that are looking rather reddish or black. So maybe I wouldn't pick those colors. Maybe I would because I like painting them and that's why I have so many. So the colors for me is really about what kind do you have and what do you like to see on the table. I don't like to see, bright purples, for instance, so much on the table. So I'd probably avoid going down an army that was very purple. Maybe the Dark Elves wouldn't be for me, for instance. It's not true. I love bright purple. I was just using an example. But when it comes to colors, I've put in some examples here. You've got flesh colors, green for the orcs. You've got those really dark colors around the dark elves, the chaos dwarves. You've got bright colors for Bretonnia and to a lesser extent, high elves and maybe some wood elves. You've got those really natural colors for the beastmen and the ogres. And then those unearthly colors for the demons where you can really just paint them whatever color you want and just go to absolute town and have a lot of fun with it. So the colors of your paint schemes are important. Paint what you want to paint. If you've just finished a Blood Angels army and you don't want to paint a whole bunch of red, keep that in mind and don't go down that direction. Ease of painting. Honestly, the factions don't differ that much between them. I was having a really good think about it. The example I've put here are Dwarves and Bretonnians, which is probably the two sides of the scale. So many of those, at least the newer dwarf miniatures, not so much the older ones, but the newer dwarf miniatures are about 95% metal, right? So if you want to be lazy with them and take some shortcuts, you can get them painted up so easily and so quickly compared to the effort that someone might want to put in for a Bretonnian army. Now, I think we're going to see a lot of Bretonnian armies that go with a more cohesive scheme than we have previously, but if you are going for an errantry style and choose to paint every single one of your Bretonnian knights with their individual heraldic colors, I think I said that right, then that will certainly be more of a challenge than dry brushing some silver and chucking some Nuln Oil over the top for the dwarves. So ease of painting comes into it, whether you don't have the time, like me, to paint wild armies, whether you prefer simplistic, maybe your skill's not quite where you want it to be, or whether you've just spent the last year painting an absolutely crazy army and you just want a bit of a palette cleanser when it comes to painting. So that is painting. I think it's a huge choice when it comes to choosing a faction, but we'll move on. Style. I've come up with kind of 6 styles that I think cover most things. There could be plenty more, and certainly there's factions that fit within these. That is 5 styles, I should say, and then the Skaven, who just do their own thing and everything at the same time. So I saw there kind of being 5 as civilized, savage, magical-ish, menacing, and foul. And notably, as I've said, some fit into multiple categories here. The ogres, for instance, they can be menacing and they've got some magic shenanigans going on. They can be a bit gross, so a bit of foul, if you will. So they can go across them. Demons also can definitely go across multiple ones here, as can vampire counts. But for civilized, I went with Empire, Bretonnians, and Dwarves. Those more kind of cleaner lines, more shinier armor, cleaner fabrics, nicer weapons. These are the kind of things we're talking about here. You've got that savage style, so that's where you're looking at the less technologically advanced factions, you might say. Saying that, some of the things the orcs and goblins are pulling off are absolutely miraculous, but I think more so because of the magic rather than their engineering. So I put the beastmen, the orcs and goblins, and ogres into these categories. For magical, I went with Tomb Kings, high elves, and wood elves, where they've got lots of magical things floating all around the place. A bunch of the models, especially the new GW ones, have magic bits and bobs coming off them or holding them up. Menacing, I've gone with warriors of chaos dwarves, and dark elves, those darker colors, those darker styles, the pointy bits all over them. Foul. So if you like gross stuff, Demons of Chaos, Nurgle are for you. Not all of the demons, of course, are found. The Slaanesh demons are positively lovely and might fit into the more magical space there, but you can pick and choose. Vampire counts. The skeletons, not so much. They've got the magical stuff going on, but once you start getting deep into the zombies and the various monsters of the vampire counts, things start getting a bit gross and wonderful. I put Skaven just in their own place down the bottom here, because they can really do whatever they want. They certainly have their more civilized ranked units, such as the Stormvermin, there we go. They've got their savage parts there, where you got all the clan rats running around, magical, they're pulling off some great magic. The menacing style, they are indeed dark and evil in their own special way. And then all the foulness of the rat ogres and what's the giant one called? I can't remember at this exact moment in time. I have one upstairs. Either way, it looks abhorrent, something horror, rat horror. No, I'm not going to get there. Either way, it looks disgusting. It's probably the most disgusting miniature GW has ever made, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's got all kinds of limbs coming out of it at weird places, multiple heads. It's great. I love it, but it is definitely disgusting. So there you go. So style. Think about what kind of army you want to put on the table, what fits your style, what gels with your way of an army looking on the table. Next up is theme. So this is actually impacted more by army selection. So, going past once you've chosen a faction, how do you want your army to look? Now, the different ideas I had here, do you want it to look knightly? Do you want it to have a steampunk vibe? Do you want it to be a bit of a horde? Do you want to go for those stealthy kind of feel? Comes a bit into gameplay as well. Do you want it to be righteous and colourful? Do you want it to be self-interested? Or do you want your army to be a destroyer of worlds? So we've got a bit of a split here of the different armies. In Knightly, you can actually go a bit all over the place. So Bretonnia is the obvious example here. Empire have their different knights, and I dare say we'll be getting some cool new knight ideas with the new lore coming out about the schism that's going on in the Empire and what the different knightly orders are doing during that time. The Dark Elves, a bunch of Cold One knights, look so fantastic when ranked up and charging across the table. You could put vampire counts in here for sure with their Blood Knights. They look amazing. Moving on into the steampunk kind of area, Empire go in here as well with their steam tanks and engineers and various different shenanigans. The Dwarves and the Skaven are classic with all the different gyrocopters and crazy doom wheels and various different things that these two factions bring to the table and the different technology. And the perfect one here is the Chaos Dwarves. So they have their amazing artillery pieces and whatnot, as well as their crazy machines that stomp across the table and rip people up with giant claws. So that's a bit of a steampunk feel to the army. You've then got this horde theme where there's just lots of miniatures. Maybe you don't paint them all with exquisite detail, but there's a lot of them on the table, and that's the kind of aesthetic you're looking for. So the armies that do that best would be the Vampire Counts, the Beastmen, the Orcs of Godland. Skaven do it well as well. I just didn't want to put Skaven in every single category. You may get the vibe that I like Skaven. So if you'd like to see a big blocks of infantry on the table, and that's what we're talking about here, right, is what kind of army do you want to see on the table from a theme perspective? Do you want to see a lot of knights, a lot of horsed mounted units charging across the table? Do you want to see crazy technological items and devices doing weird and wonderful things? Do you want to see big hordes of infantry? Do you want to see smaller units that are hiding and trying to avoid the enemy and plinking away pathetic and cowardly arrows? Or do you want to see a really righteous army? Here we're looking at the High Elves, the Dwarves, the Empire. There's a really pure army that you can feel good. You get to be the good guys. Some players, they just love to be the good guys, and they like their armies to look like the good guys, and they will play them every single time, and that's okay. Do you want an army and a character that's a bit more selfish, a bit more self-interested? The Tomb Kings, the Ogres, Orcs and Goblins, I wouldn't say they're evil necessarily, but they're certainly doing their own thing for their own reasons, and that comes into the way the army looks and the way you build it. And then, do you just want to go full evil, full destroyer of worlds? The Chaos is the main one here, and then you're just happy. You're happy to be absolutely evil and play to that style and build to that narrative. So that is the aesthetics of the different factions. I think this is one of the most important choices you will make. Indeed, I think along with lore, this is probably the most important because it's a hobby, right? It's a miniatures game. You have to like the look of these miniatures, you have to like painting these miniatures, and you have to like how they look on the table. So that's why it's up front. But let's move on from aesthetic. Let's talk about the playstyle. And I've touched on them already, but this is more of actually when we're rolling dice, what are these armies doing? And once again, a bunch of these armies do different things and can be put into multiple areas for these styles of play. But I've been kind of generic and gone for the ones they do the best. So the 5 playstyles I've looked at is a shooting playstyle, combat, balanced, speed, and endurance down the bottom. Now, I didn't need to add a 5th. Tomb Kings could have gone into balanced, I'm sure, or more of a combat orientated, but I liked endurance. I like the idea of an army that just won't die and just sticks around and just keeps coming back. So we'll start off with shooting. So if you want to do a bunch of shooting, well, look, is this the game for you? Unsure at this point. Certainly in 8th edition, shooting generally was quite weak. They've made some changes, whereas I think in this edition it'll be a bit more balanced and shooting will have a bit of a better impact on the game for a few different reasons that I'll go into in future videos. But the main 2 factions that I see as shooting factions, as it were, are the Wood Elves and the Dwarves. Now, the Dwarves do just fine in combat, but their shooting really is, for the most part, above and beyond a lot of other factions. And I didn't put them in balance because they're not doing magic things, right? Now, the Wood Elves, their infantry crumbles pretty quickly if they get into a sustained combat. They want to hit hard and fast and get out of there. So I didn't put them into combat or balance for those reasons, but their shooting is just amazing. It has to be some of the best in the game, certainly from an infantry shooting perspective. So that's why they belong here. Now, there are some other factions that do shooting very well. The Empire do it fine. High Elves and Dark Elves do it quite well, and Chaos Dwarves do it excellently. But those factions also have other parts to them, and that's why I've put them down in the balance section, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now let's look at combat. So there are some factions that do pretty much no shooting, or almost no shooting. Demons of Chaos, they can do a bit depending on how you build them. If you're going strong with a Zenich flavor, you get some magical shooting there. But for the most part, they want to get into combat, and they either want to hold things up or tear it apart. The vampire counts, geez, I could be wrong, but outside magical attacks, I don't think they have any shooting at all. Please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but they are very much a combat army. So that's what they're here to do. That's what they're about. And Warriors of Chaos, yes, they have the Hell Cannon, I suppose, and a few other little bits and pieces. But for the most part, they are very much a combat army, and that's where they want to be. They want to be right up in your enemy's face. You will be advancing and getting in there with smaller elite blocks of infantry that can do absolutely amazing things and take a lot of hits. Now in the balance section, I've put Chaos Dwarves, Empire, Orcs and Goblins, High Elves, Dark Elves, and Skaven. These armies can all do shooting quite well. High Elves and Dark Elves with their high ballistic skill in particular can do it very well. They all do combat just fine. Probably the weakest in combat is either Skaven or Empire. Probably Skaven from this part for most of their units. They have a few units that do combat just fantastically, but their main bread and butter units that you're going to be bringing to the table aren't really dedicated combat units. They want to hold while a few of your units do some significant damage and play around with the enemy's morale. So more of a balanced style here. High Elves and Dark Elves both have great combat units. Orcs and Goblins, their combat units are obviously amazing, but their shooting's pretty good as well. Their infantry shooting is mediocre, but their war machines, every now and again, can really get the job done. So there we go. There's the factions that I think are most balanced, and for players who want to do something in every one of the phases, being it shooting, being it combat, being it movement, or being it not that there's a magical phase, but pulling off a bunch of spells throughout the game, these are probably the factions that you're looking for. Next up is speed. So if you want an army that goes fast, you're looking at Bretonnians, Ogres. I've put Beastmen here mainly because of their ambush rules that they can get for their various units, and because they do actually have a lot of units that move quite fast. Ogres, yes, they're mostly infantry based. Saying that they're Mournfang, am I saying that right? Their Mournfang cavalry are absolute monsters. We did play our first game of Old World recently, and they were a nightmare. But yes, their main infantry, I believe, the Ogres are movement 6, which is fast. It's double the speed of a dwarf, that's for sure, and it will get you across the board and into combat and where you want to be very quickly. And then, of course, Bretonnians, they're on horses. There's lots of them. They're going fast. They're speeding across the table. Most things will have Swiss stride. They'll do work. And lastly, the endurance piece. So Tomb Kings, while their skeletons aren't necessarily tougher than a regular, well, I mean, they are because they have regeneration until things start going horribly wrong, but also because you can use your magic to bring them back. And yes, you can do this for the vampire counts, but I feel Tomb Kings just do it a little bit better, and it'll be interesting to see if I'm proven wrong. But otherwise, they have, and I didn't put them in combat because they are a bit more balanced in the fact that they do shooting quite well as well, and they could have gone imbalanced, but I wanted to put them in endurance just because they're a little more than just a combat army, but they're also, I think, one of the toughest ones with their magic and their general undead rules combined. So there's the playstyle here. So pick an army that you want to play on the table is the message. If you love sitting back and shooting or running around and shooting, those top two factions are for you. If you just want to get in close and chop stuff up and not have to worry about ballistic skill, you know which factions you're choosing. If you want to have something to do in each of the phases and throughout your turn and the enemy's turn, then balanced speed. If you like to go super fast and just slam into things and try and pull off some wild flanking maneuvers, that's the factions you're looking at. And if you just want an army that refuses to die, Tomb Kings go pretty well. And look, dwarves can probably come down into this endurance very easily as well. They are absolutely tough as nails from a morale perspective, certainly, as well as an armor save and toughness perspective. So that's the playstyle. Super important. Play an army you actually want to, play on the table. There are people who collect just for the love of the miniatures, and they love painting, and they love them sitting on their shelves, and they don't play the game that much. That's absolutely fine. You don't have to worry about this section. Same. There's some people who don't paint their armies, and I know that is a horrific thing to say, but there are plenty of grey miniatures kicking around on tables, and people are still somehow having fun with them, and that's okay too. So if the aesthetics, the painting part up the front, that might not apply to everybody. So pick and choose, people, throughout this guide on which parts are relevant to you with how you like to engage with this hobby. But next up, I want to talk to lore, and this should be an important part for everyone because the lore of Warhammer is just fantastic, and we have a whole new lore setting to play with. We've gone back in time a few hundred years. I think I'm not too deep on it yet, but you better believe the first thing I did when I started reading the Old World rulebook was started reading the new lore, and I actually really felt good about it. It's not as doom and gloom as 8th edition, that kind of current. Is it Old World? I don't think we'd call it Old World. That old school 8th edition feel of everything was going horribly wrong. Not so much with this lore. There's still a glimmer of hope. The dwarves are a great example of that. They're doing okay. Yes, there's not as many of them as there used to be, but it is not the end times, figuratively and literally. So the lore of an army, I think, is super important. You should play with an army that you like the lore of, the background of, and there's certain different ways you can engage with the lore. So we've got the characters piece, the philosophy, and then down the bottom, the events, locations, and army of infantry when it comes to choosing a lore that fits what you want out of an army. So when it comes to characters, I like to choose an army that has some characters that I can really enjoy. I think every one of my fantasy army has a smattering of special characters across them because I just love the characters from Warhammer. They're just so over the top and so much fun. Now, we don't have a lot at the moment. So either you wait for your Arcane Journal to see if that's the kind of, the more Arcane Journals to come out, seeing if that's the kind of special characters you want to run. Bretonnians and Tomb Kings have some characters at the moment, and they will appeal to different people. Or, there's two other options. You could look at some 8th edition characters, whether they be ones that would be alive during this setting, or ones that you kind of just like the vibe of, and you want to run them anyway, and you run them using Old World rules, using maybe just generic characters that you give some special items to match the theme of that 8th edition character. That's kind of cool and an idea too. If you're really passionate about Grimgor Ironhide, well, take a black war boss. What are they called? Black armored? No, wow, names are escaping me today. The orcs, the really bad ones that wear black armor. I'm sure I've said it somehow in that combination of words. But either way, take one of those war bosses, stick a few magical weapons on him, and suddenly you get to represent Grimgor with that miniature in the way that you want to when you play your games. And the last one there is make up your own characters. And it's not there, it's not on the slide. I'm just making this up as I go. Make up your own characters. So I really like the model, Grudgebearer. Thorgrim Grudgebearer, I want to say. He's a dwarf. He's got a bunch of guys holding him up. It is the most obnoxious and outrageous shield bearer situation going on ever. I mean, he's not on a shield, so I guess they don't call him a shield bearer. Either way, that model for me is just absolute peak fantasy. Now, of course, Thorgrim doesn't yet have rules. He may, because I dare say he's pretty old being a dwarf, so he's probably around at this time, but he definitely wouldn't be the Lord of all dwarves at this time, from my understanding. Unless he is. Jeez, I wouldn't want to get that wrong. I need to learn my lore better, but I will. I'll get there. So I want to use that miniature, so I'm just going to chuck it on a 50x50 base, which is what the shield bearer goes on now, and I'm going to use that old school miniature to be my dwarf lord, and he's going to build his own narrative as he goes and just have a lot of fun, and he's going to look amazing. And that's why I love dwarves. So many reasons, but mostly because of that miniature and that character. And that's okay, and that's what I'm trying to say here is choosing a faction because of one specific character is definitely legit, both from a lore perspective and from a gameplay perspective too. So the influence the characters can have on the game is always something I'm really interested in. Do they bring special units? Do they give bonuses to certain units? Is that going to impact the way I build an army? And that is always the type of character I like to engage with. So, characters, still a relative unknown. We will get more and more information on that as Arcane Journals continue to drop. But for now, for Bretonnian and Tomb King players, I dare say that'll be influencing the kind of army they build and whether they choose those factions. Philosophy. You've got to kind of enjoy the philosophy of your army. If you really want to embrace the narrative and just immerse yourself within this setting and this game, if you're playing Chaos Warriors, you have to be all about conquering and killing everything. If you're orcs and goblins, you have to be okay that all your goblins are gonna die. A lot of your orcs are gonna die, but they're gonna die doing what they love, which is fighting and just killing and loving war, and be a little slapstick about it as well. So these different factions play and build in a way that can sometimes be a little silly. And if that's not how you want to play games, then orcs and goblins are not for you. The proud nature of the High Elves, if you're a bit haughty, then they're probably for you. The determination and nature of the Dwarves. You've got the scheming of the Skaven, and just the hatefulness of the Dark Elves. So if you want to go down that route from a lore perspective and just really embrace the philosophy of certain factions, have a look at the different ones, see what they're about, read up on their lore, and go for a narrative that suits your style. The next one is events, locations, and army of infamy. And this comes down into the faction build and the army build as well. So certainly before I start painting my Bretonnian army, I'll be looking at all the different kinds. You better believe I'm pushing towards an exile army at the moment for various reasons that I'll go into in a future video. But I will then want to look at, well, what kind of campaigns are exiled armies getting into? How will that shape the particular army faction? What's the word I'm looking for here? The type of Bretonnian I'm then building. Which lord am I choosing? Which duke to then build the army around, which will obviously then impact the heraldic nature of it, the color scheme you're using, the unit choices that you're making. So campaigns, battles, events, these are all reasons to pick certain armies and certain factions. I like the Empire as a good example. You might want to choose them because you have a specific area of the Empire that you want to build to, whether it be the Border Princes, the rough and ready nature of it, whether it be Ostermark, Mootland, and the shenanigans they're getting up to in the forest there, or whether it's Westerland and maybe a bit of a naval-themed force that's doing marine-type actions and coming off certain conversions that you can then make for your army around that piece. Maybe you got your hands on a land ship and just get to go absolutely nuts and make up own old world rules for that. So there's a lot of fun to be had when you're choosing a faction and getting deep into the lore and letting that guide you on what kind of faction you choose and then how you build out that army within that faction. Bretonnian Exiles are the best example here. So many opportunities. The best example we have so far with their Arcane Journal already being out for a really unique army. I've already picked up some unique kind of third-party alternative miniatures, which I'll do a review on soon, that perfectly fit the Bretonnian Exiles and just bring so much flavor to it. And one of the reasons I've gone with Bretonnians is because of that Exile list and how much fun I think it will be and how unique that army has the opportunity to look. So that's the lore piece. We'll now move on to the last one, and that is the miniature range. So there's three pieces here. There's the availability, there's the quality, and then there's the expense. So availability is a big one with Old World at the moment, as I'm sure absolutely everyone is aware. And ironically enough, it's those legacy factions that have the best availability. So Lizardmen, Ogres, Skaven, Demons of Chaos, Vampire Counts, Warriors of Chaos, Beastmen, and Dark Elves all have a range of some nature through Age of Sigmar, and that's why I think you'll find they're legacy factions. For the most part, Warriors of Chaos are the standout there, uniquely. I think, yeah, that's correct, and that's going to be really interesting to see how GW do that, because in my mind, the reason we have core factions, why we have legacy factions, is because they didn't want to repeat the Age of Sigmar line. They didn't want to use the Age of Sigmar lines for the most part in the Old World. They didn't want to redo lines of miniatures for factions that were already so well represented as well. They didn't want to double up like that. So the core factions, Beastmen are different there as well. But for the most part, core factions don't have a strong presence in Age of Sigmar, whereas the legacy factions do. There are exceptions, Warriors of Chaos and Beastmen, but for Warriors of Chaos in particular, I think we'll find that they will release Old World style Warriors of Chaos that are different for what we have for Age of Sigmar. Now, I could be wrong. It will be interesting to see. But the Warriors of Chaos of old are a lot less dynamic, certainly a lot smaller, much more practical for ranking up. Those new Warriors of Chaos, or Slaves to Darkness, I think they call them in Age of Sigmar, models are absolutely fantastic. Are they appropriate for a rank and file game? Maybe. Not as much as the old school Warriors of Chaos line, so it'll be super interesting to see if there's a bit of repackaging going on, a bit of rebranding, or whether they release both a Old World Warriors of Chaos line separate to the Age of Sigmar line, with miniatures kind of representing the same thing, but being different for different reasons. But as I went back to my point though, the availability piece is that, hilariously enough, these legacy factions have better availability than your core factions at the moment. And this will change over time, but geez, it's going to take some time. And we'll get to that in a moment. And I've got Chaos Warriors twice there because I did want to talk about them separately. And that's absolutely fine. So there are a few exceptions to this. Factions such as the Dark Elves, for instance, and the Beastmen as well, they have a lot of units that are temporarily out of stock. Now, I don't know if they're going to stay temporarily out of stock. Sometimes when GW says temporarily, they don't really mean it. But yes, so they have full lines in Age of Sigmar for the most part. There's a few little bits and pieces where that's not true. For the Dark Elves, for instance, they're bolt throwers. I don't think you can get those anymore from GW. And look, there's plenty of other ways to get those that I'm sure I don't have to go into, whether it be chasing them down on eBay or 3D printing them. But yeah, so temporarily out of stock is an issue for some of these factions. Not so much for others, and just parts of the factions for some of them. Lizardmen, you can get plenty of Saurus and Skinks, but if you want to start getting some of the bigger dinosaurs, that becomes a little tricky in hunting them down. Now, going into the availability of the other factions, Bretonnians and Tomb Kings, hilariously enough, have terrible availability right now. They are the only really old world factions we have to start off with, and they're all sold out. For two reasons. One, I don't think GW thought this was going to be as popular as it did, so it didn't produce probably as many as were needed. And the other being that it is super popular. And people went absolutely nuts for Old World, which I love to see and is absolutely fantastic, but it means that almost everything is sold out across the world for these two factions, the Bretonnians and the Tomb Kings right now, which is a shame. I'm sure more stock's coming. I'm sure GW are madly trying to get more of this produced, and we should see it restocked over the next month or two. And then it comes to the next kind of core factions. Yep, the key is to say factions lots. So Empire, Orcs and Goblins, High Elves, Wood Elves, these will come eventually. People have theorized when we'll see these and how we see these. The only one we know for sure and when it's coming at the moment is the Orcs and Goblins. They are coming next, which is fantastic because they are not represented well by Age of Sigmar at all, outside of some savage orcs. I will never say that other word they use to describe them. But Orcs and Goblins are coming. They are being supported in a immense and wonderful way with all the metal miniatures that are being released for them. The metal trolls, those old school metal trolls being re-released, I just absolutely love. They could have been lazy and used Age of Sigmar trolls, but they haven't, and I love that. So they're coming. They'll be available soon-ish. I don't think we have a time frame for Orcs and Goblins, but I expect in the next couple of months. And then Empire, High Elves, Wood Elves will probably follow over the next 6 to 12 months. So they will come, but for now are quite tricky to get your hands on. Empire, there's a couple of units here and there. You can get some cheeky battle wizards, a steam tank. You can certainly get started on an Empire army, but not the... maybe some Demon Griffs even you can get your hands on. Maybe not, but for the most part, that faction is not able to be purchased. High Elves, once again, onesies and twosies, but they were, for the most part, completely replaced by the weird kind of cow-worshipping mountain elves that exist in Age of Sigmar, and Wood Elves are just non-existent except for their dryads and their tree lords and that part of the army. So there's bits and pieces of these factions, the core factions that you can start collecting now if you want to get ahead of the game and wait for your army box. And then lastly, there's Chaos Dwarves, all out on their lonesome, as they should be. The Forge World line of Chaos Dwarves, to my understanding, is out of production. I don't believe you can get them anymore in a retail sense. So the only option you have for Chaos Dwarves is to use alternative sourced miniatures or to go 3D printed. And there are some absolutely amazing 3D printed designs for Chaos Dwarves. So that is the route that I will be going down. I'm not going to say would be going down. I'm going to say will be going down, because you better believe I'm going to get in on those, because I think that army is going to be fantastic. Moving on, looking at quality. Now, this is very subjective. I talked about this during the Heresy, where I think it's less subjective for Horus Heresy. There are some objectively good miniatures and objectively bad miniatures. When it comes to the Old World, I don't think I can really say that. There's certainly some dated miniatures, and that's a topic I want to talk about on another day. I don't mind that old school style. But saying that, there's some Skaven miniatures, for instance, which are a bit long in the tooth and looking a little sad, and yet so available. You can get so much Skaven still through Age of Sigmar. It's ridiculous. Go for that army, people, if you want to make it easy on yourself. But from a quality perspective, I think across the line, the Old World miniatures look fantastic. There isn't really an army I look at and say, that looks lazy or terrible. Probably, yeah. Some of the Skaven miniatures maybe not as fantastic. Some of those really old ones. Some of the Beastmen maybe are looking a little sad these days. But outside of that, I think it's all quality. People, Old World equals quality. So I'll move on. Expense is the next one there. So when it comes to spending money on this game, the most affordable ones are going to be those army boxes that come out. They're absolutely great deals. The Tomb Kings and Bretonnian boxes, especially if you're getting them at a sweet third-party retail discount, are just absolute value. So those armies, as they get their army boxes released, that will be the most affordable way to afford these factions. Outside of that, when you look at legacy armies versus Age of Sigmar armies, so what I'm talking about here, noting that they're both technically legacy factions, but the Dark Elves are a great example. So there's a bunch of Dark Elf units where you can pick up 10 dark pointy-eared boys for about $46 to $47 dues, which is very affordable. $40 for a unit of 10 Dark Shards, for instance, 46 maybe, that's good. That's actually pretty good. I'm not sad about that at all. That's Australian dollars. Whereas for 10 Saurus, because they're recently released and they got redone and their new range looks amazing. It looks fantastic. No one's saying it doesn't. But for 10 Saurus warriors who aren't costing that much more than 10 Dark Elves, you're looking at like $105, right? So you're paying more than double for the same amount of infantry for Saurus versus Dark Shards. And you're going to see that theme continue across Age of Sigmar factions that have been done more recently versus Age of Sigmar factions or fantasy old world factions that have not been given the updated, spruced up Age of Sigmar treatment. So if you're looking for affordability there, definitely look at some of those factions that haven't been touched since Age of Sigmar dropped. Skaven is a pretty good example, but not the best. Dark Elves are probably the best example there. Ogres are a pretty good example as well. Demons are still relatively cheap compared to really your Lizardmen, your Vampire counts, are your Warriors of Chaos, if you're going down the Slaves of Darkness line, are probably the best examples of those that have been really costed up. Dwarves as well, certainly the new dwarf miniatures are much more expensive than they used to be as they've been redone. But once again, 10 dwarves, you're probably looking at about $70. It's those lizard men and those vampire counts and Slaves of Darkness, which are really going to cost money if you want to try and build them out as an old world faction using Age of Sigmar models. Next, Horde vs Elite. Some factions are just going to be more expensive because you need more miniatures. Perfect examples, your Orcs and Goblins, your Skaven, your vampire counts. You're just going to have Tomb Kings to an extent, depending on how you want to build them out. Beastmen. Did I say Beastmen? Maybe. Those factions are going to be more expensive because you're just going to need more miniatures. Your elite armies, the Warriors of Chaos, you don't need as many. Running a unit of 10 Warriors of Chaos, I think, will be totally viable in this edition. So they're just going to bring the price down a little. Wood Elves are another good example. They get real costly real fast. So you're not going to need as many. Once we can actually get some Wood Elves that aren't $500 on eBay for 5 horses. So next up is just 3D printing. So Chaos Dwarves being the main faction that I would recommend you 3D print here because you have literally no other choice. That's going to be real cheap. I won't go into how cheap 3D printing is, but once I start building that army, I will be doing a video series on it to show you how much it will cost me to build a Chaos Dwarf army going down that route. And that is all I wanted to speak about for miniature range. You've got the availability, which varies wildly and is ironically better for most legacy armies. You've got the quality, which I think doesn't come into it too much because so much of these lines are just beautiful miniatures, whether they're older or not. And then the expense piece, where you really want an army box to come out if you're looking to do this in an affordable manner. So the last thing I want to do is use this as a bit of an example of how we then may choose a faction. So I've got the core factions and the legacy factions up the top. We'll do it in a bit of a manner whereby we cut options out as we go, as we use our table that we have in front of us as an example. So aesthetics. Let's start talking about how we choose a faction. When it comes to paint scheme, there's certain things I do and don't want to be doing. I don't think for my army after Bretonnians, what we're talking about here, because Bretonnians are coming. They're coming. They're arriving on my doorstep in a couple of weeks. We still don't have them because we live in Australia and we get things slower. There's some ships that are involved, maybe some people rocketing some ships, who can say? But I'm not seeing the Bretonnians for another 2 weeks. I will then do Bretonnians, but I'm talking about my next faction. How do I choose my next faction? So the next one, I'm not going to be wanting to paint a whole lot of fabric. I'm going to get into that in Bretonnia. There's going to be fabric going anywhere, so that cuts out them. So Bretonnia can go to begin with. They are dead to me because they're already done. Probably the Wood Elves are out at that perspective as well if I don't want to be painting a lot of fabric. Who else? Who else is covered in fabric here? That's probably it. When it comes from that perspective. Probably not Empire at that point as well. I've just painted a whole bunch of humans with a whole bunch of fabric, a whole bunch of flesh, so I think Empire are probably out as well. So there we go, right from the start, our first line of aesthetics. We've made some choices and they were pretty easy to make. The next one comes down to style. So I've just done a very civilized army with the Bretonnians. I probably want to do something a little more out there. So let's cut out our civilized armies. So that includes the Empire, Bretonnian, and Dwarves. The Dwarves can go. They're not gonna get done. I don't want to paint a bunch of bright silver armor and then paint it all over again in a slightly different and shorter way. The next one is themed. So I just painted a bunch of knights. I'm not going to want to go for a bunch of more mounted miniatures. So those armies that are very strong in the mounted options, I'm probably going to steer away from and are looking in that kind of clean knightly aesthetic. So I'm going to get rid of the dark elves. We're not doing it. And at the same time, we might cut the high elves out as well. We're going to move into a bit of a different aesthetic and do something slightly different for the next faction. So moving on into playstyle. Now, Bretonnians, they're all about that speed. They're all about charging into combat. So from that perspective, I'm probably going to cut out the fast armies. So ogres were one of my fast armies there. We'll give them the chop, and then beastmen being the other one there. We'll get rid of those. I'm not into ambushing right now. The Bretonnians will be fast enough for me. I want a faction that does things a little bit differently. Same. Bretonnians are very combat orientated. So we'll move away from that and we'll get into a more balanced faction, I think I'll be looking for. So I'm going to cut out my combat factions. We're going to cut Demons of Chaos. They're all about that combat. We're going to cut Warriors. Where are they? Where are they hiding? The Warriors of Chaos, they can be cut. We don't want to do just combat. We've got enough of that already. What's my other combat faction name? Vampire Counts. They're going to go. Have they already been cut? No, but they have now. They're cut. So already, by deciding what I do and don't want to do, I've already worked out which factions are left. And yes, I'm doing it from the perspective of removing things more so than moving towards things. But you can go either way you want on what you do want to do or what you don't want to do. For instance, if you wanted to have a balanced playstyle, well, that lets you know which ones to cut out. So I'm left with Tomb Kings, Orcs and Goblins, Lizardmen, Skaven, and Chaos Dwarves. And we're only 2 areas in. Now, next up, we're looking at lore. Let's see, philosophy. What am I or aren't I looking for here? I don't think that's going to have a big impact, lore, at the moment. I need to read more of it before I can start making some informed decisions there. So I'm going to skip over that one for now. But if you really loved, for instance, Cetra, you were all about him. That really makes your choice for you, doesn't it? But we won't. We'll then look at the miniature range. So if we're looking at these factions, the miniature range for Tomb Kings is obviously very available at the moment, which is good. I want something that will be pretty easy to do. Orcs and Goblins, I won't be able to do them yet, but saying that, by the time I come to build this army, I will be able to, depending on how quickly it all settles out. Lizardmen, I think I'm going to cut at this point. They're just so expensive to build in an old world fashion right now in what's available for Age of Sigmar, so I'm going to cut it. I'm looking for a bit of a cheaper army for the one up next. Skaven, I think some of those miniatures are looking a little old and sad, so I'm gonna cut that one from a quality perspective, which leaves me now with 3. And my only decision that comes down to it is the expense piece. Now, the Tomb Kings, we can assume their army box will be re-released. I can't get my hands on it right now, though, so we're gonna cut them as well. I literally can't get Tomb Kings, saying that I think we will see a lot of secondhand miniatures start to come up over the next few months, which will be great, which leaves just Orcs and Goblins and Chaos Dwarves. Well, I already have a sizable Orcs and Goblins army, so I'm happy to easily cut them. So that leaves, here we go, using the table and my systematic decision making, it has brought me to Chaos Dwarves. Was that a bit rigged? Maybe. I'm pretty excited about them. Can do them cheap, they can look amazing, they're super balanced in their playstyle, and I think they will just be so much fun. And we've wanted them forever, right? People have wanted Chaos Dwarves since 6th edition. We had the Forge World rules in 8th edition, but it wasn't a real faction. Now it kind of almost is. Certainly it's more legitimate than it ever was. So that's the road I'm going to go down, because I love those hats, people. I love those hats. So there we go. That's how I have used the table to come to a decision, and that is how you can use the table to come to a decision. And that, at the end of all of this, brings us to the end of our Old World chats for today. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully, I've helped you decide on which faction to choose for your next army, or helped you confirm that you've already made the right choice. If not, awkward. Put down in the comments below which faction you'll be choosing and why. But importantly, make sure to keep rolling those dice and getting fired up for fantasy.